is Jane Low, and I'm at the Singapore FinTech Festival 2023. And with me today, I'm really excited to have David Hardoon, who I have not seen since before the pandemic.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's been a while.
been a while. So, who is the Chief Data and AI Officer at the Union Bank of Philippines, as well as the Chief Executive Officer with Aboitiz Innovation. Right,
yes.
right, yeah. And of course, you're going to be sharing with us about everything about AI and data privacy and ethics and all that, right? So thank you so much for your time today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me back after such a long period.
I know, right? Yeah, so really excited to see, how things have changed since then, because obviously you had extensive experience in these areas in Singapore, as well as now working, with Philippines entities. So very interested to hear what do you see in terms of the latest AI innovations and what kind of AI ethics questions do they expose?
So the wondrous thing, maybe if I start this way, about AI is it's really constantly changing and evolving. So I want to start with that as a precursor. I remember that I used to get asked on a regular basis, David, can we have like a 5-year roadmap of AI and what's going to happen? And I honestly used to say, that's not possible. I can barely give you 1 year in the future because things just so dramatically change.
Right.
And there you go,
Yeah.
generative AI.
Right.
Even though, if you look at it from a research point of view, if you look at it from a publication, the beta applications that have been coming out, technically it's not new, but the readiness of that version that came out to the market and how it basically took everyone by storm because it fully kind of quote unquote solved that problem of interface, interaction. It suddenly felt like you're having a conversation, you're having a dialogue, and it can do all these wonderful things. So if you're talking about the recent, impactful AI, it has to be that because it suddenly made it relatable.
That's right.
Suddenly, the ideas of I can create predictions, I can do forecasting, I can optimize. Sure, great, wonderful, exciting. But he always had a bit of but you need to have a statistician, you need to have a data scientist.
Exactly.
You need to have someone to kind of act in between the business and the intelligent engine. There came the applications now of Gen AI and suddenly said, well, I'm not your personal librarian that speaks your language. So ironically, but that's also now some of the recent, introduction of new challenges, or slightly of a change in terms of the challenges or the risks, since you were also asking about the ethics aspect of things. Because if you think about us, when you ask me a question, I will resort to my domain knowledge or what I'm familiar with to answer the question. And if I don't know, I will say, I don't know. Now, you've now created this capability that effectively is generating content. If I oversimplify it, how do we know it's right? How do we know it's not adding anecdotal, creative information?
Right, yes,
How do we know? So that's the new layer of complexity. Previously, it was about, is AI being used that's resulting in discrimination? Is AI being used in a manner that is proper for, applications in terms of, let's say, scale, amplification, whatnot? So it still was very technical, quote unquote, kind of concerns that you wanted to put this kind of ring fence around it from an ethics or governance point of view. But now suddenly, it's contextual.
That's right, yeah.
If I throw this term very lightly, falsehoods. How do we suddenly deal with those? We will, but these are now the new questions that have come up.
Right, okay, I'm going to ask you a question now about, how different is it from reality, really, to be honest, because, say you and we have different opinions, right? And sometimes I may sort of exaggerate things, or I may make up things if I'm a child, you ask as a parent, the child can make up lies, right? So it's not some people say it's not really any difference than a, human reality, right?
So I'm going to give you the, not the politically correct answer, but I'm going to give you the in-between one. It's a yes and a no. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's not different. It's exactly how you described it. And this a lot of times, if you look at kind of the ethical circles, you're almost realizing that it's a mirror turned back on us. Where the question mark is, how have we been dealing with this so far? And in
Not
some
very
areas,
well.
yeah, that's kind of why I paused there. Where some things not so very well. But you see, but now that's the no part, where AI introduces a new level of complexity. At least with a person, if you're lying to me, or if you're fabricating something, presumably, you may feel guilty. Presumably.
Presumably.
You may want to say, come back to me late and say, oh, David, look, actually, there's some degree of a moral compass with respect to the information. And sometimes
In general,
there isn't.
yes.
Sometimes there isn't. There could be prejudice, whatnot, or just a creative imagination. But it's still contained. It's still control. Because however, you have an access to a wealth of knowledge and information, it's finite. But now suddenly you have this capability that theoretically has an infinite capacity.
That's right, yeah.
That in principle, and some may disagree, doesn't have a moral compass. You can even instruct it to saying, I want you to respond to me as if you're a child who's 5 years old,
you could.
who is
Yes, that's right.
exaggerating.
That's right. Yeah.
So now you suddenly have this almost...
Elastic.
Yeah, like this elastic thing, which, by the way, for creative people, it's amazing. It's like,
Oh, absolutely.
just throw it, try it, see what happens. But now, how do you go, well, but how do we curtail these things that may be potential from just, I'm trying to look at the right word, but from incorrect or annoying to truly harmful?
Right, okay. So this, I think this trustworthiness of AI, I think that's the term, umbrella term that people
Yes.
tend to attach to AI ethics, right? It has to be transparent, explainable, accountable, etc., right? But explainability, right, for example, is even difficult in the current technology, without AI, right? Like, for example, if I go to a social media platform the other day, I post a question. And I won't name the social media platform, but I posed a certain question, which I thought was totally benign, but the question was censored, right? I make appeal, it reverts to some human, sort of response back. But still, there's no explanation. So what I'm saying is that this is a very benign case. It doesn't impact my lifestyle, it doesn't impact, my finances, but this is just a very, very simple case where we don't get any explanation, even with very basic technology. So now with AI, you have very complex models. How are you going to get explainability?
So let me perhaps try and kind of break it down into 3 layers. The first one is exactly what you said right now. And if I go back, if you remember, the feed principles that were released from MAS,
exactly.
one of the principles was that AI or AI-based decisions should be held to at least the same standards and level as to human-based decisions. And the reason for that is today you don't explain. You see, already there's an issue here. It's like, so then should you be expecting that from a technology? Should you be expecting that from AI? Now, I understand why people say that because it goes back to the term of trust. Explainability establishes trust. So the first level is we need to start leveraging and using the need of this technology to maybe start, maybe the word correcting is a bit harsh, but revising how we've been doing things today.
Okay.
That's one. Then the second one is, and I want to double click on this term explainability. When we say explainability, we take it in a very literal sense. And again, at a lack of a better description, in an analog sense. When I say, can you please explain something to me? You go, okay, here's my explanation. But when you look at AI, when you look at this type of technology, you need to contextualize explainability. I'll explain what I mean. And I think the best way is, let's talk about electric vehicles. I know roughly how an electrical engine works, how an electric car works. But if you tell me, David, explain to me in detail how the engine functions, I can't do that. But I will still drive a Tesla. I will still drive an electric vehicle, right? But the reason I will do that is because I can explain to you how a car works. I can explain to you when I work it, how the steering wheel is supposed to react, how the brake is supposed to react. And if, God forbid, something happens, there's someone in the supply chain who's able to address. If there's something breaks, there'll be a distributor, there'll be a mechanic, or if needed all the way, there'll be the manufacturer. We need to think of AI in the exact same way. It's a supply chain. Explainability needs to be contextualized. Because when people say, explain to me how a deep learning algorithm works, that's analogous almost to saying, explain to me how the neurons in your brain are firing when you're answering me this question. You see, it's the right layer. So I just want to emphasize this. Now, with this in the context, the third layer is, so how do we explain? So let me give you an example of in generative AI. So when they realize that, we have to have this explainability, how do we introduce the explainability? Well, one way of introducing explainability is I'm going to tell you what are my sources. When I answer you the question, I'll be like, here, these are all the sources in which I relied on to give you the summary. Now, you may then go, no. This source is dubious, or this source I don't trust, or this, therefore I will downweight the credibility of your response. These sources, they are trustworthy. Does it mean that your answer is correct? Not necessarily.
Yeah, it's up to you how do you interpret
but at
the
least
source,
it's
right?
trustworthy.
Yeah,
So you see,
I
that's
see what you mean.
one example of explainability.
It's like being transparent.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. So it's a bit like writing academic papers, and then at the end of that, you cite all your references and your research papers,
Exactly.
right? Earlier you talk about moral compass, right? And you talk about electric vehicles, but I want to bring out self-driving cars, right?
Okay, yeah.
And of course, when we talk about self-driving cars and moral compass and dilemmas and all that, the very popular example is, you're driving and then, you have a choice, right? You either hit,
The trolley problem.
That's right. The old lady or the children, what do you choose, right? So in a human context, we can't choose, right? Self-driving cars, of course, I think at the end of the day, it has to revert to a human driver. But in the first, I guess, couple of, layers of decision making, there has to be some mechanics. To what extent do we expect that AI can code these kind of human dilemma questions?
So look, it's a good question, but again, allow me to go back. At least when I did my driving license, no one asked me that question. So you see, it's going back to that question of, are we holding things to a higher standard than we expect ourselves to? Again, perhaps borderline philosophical, but I think an important, pin to put there. That's number one. Number two is, and I can't remember where I read this, but I was reading, I think it was a mother and a daughter. And the same thing. The mother was asking her daughter, and it was a relatively young daughter, in terms of, electrical vehicles, self-driving vehicles. If there's a choice between, unfortunately killing the young child or the older, what will happen? And I was hilarious. I was reading it, and the daughter just said, "But mommy, the car will just stop."
Oh, of course.
So there will always be a scenario whereby any loss of life is, of course, and again, if I use this example, is unfortunate, it can be done. But in the end of the day, when you are in a car and you are in an awful situation, you do everything possible to minimize risk, to minimize the severity of an incident. Ironically, a self-driving vehicle, because it has no emotion, because it doesn't have that panic, which I don't know about you, but sometimes when the car skids and it's a wet road, you have that instant of panic, may be better or further equipped in order to mitigating the risk, in order the fact that it doesn't have to choose effectively. Now, I know this is a cop-out answer, it doesn't answer which one, but I keep on going back to saying we shouldn't let these kind of existential questions stopping us from realizing that we're dealing with this problem every single day. Now, like you said, and I think you gave the example of maybe initially we're saying, well, we know what, we can't trust it yet. Then you have the requirement of your hands on the steering wheel. You will have to choose.
Exactly, that's right, yeah. At least we go back to this trustworthy principle of accountability in the field, right?
Exactly, the accountability. And then with time, we can test it out. Now, when I say test it out, I don't mean that we put it in a situation where we actually to choose which one it runs over. But just like we have test dummies, we have crash tests, we can simulate. We can run the scenarios, we can learn it, we can identify. And what's now important is that if there is a situation whereby there is an accident, with data, with information, it is able to empirically estimate that this was an unfortunate, but something that could truly not be avoided, and what could be rectified and what could be learned from it. So I like to think of myself as pragmatically optimistic, and looking at those opportunities that we can improve versus, there's a risk, so we're not going to do it, kind of scenario.
That's right. You talk about emotions as well, right? When we encounter such a situation that, we may suddenly be panicking, right? When we talk about AI ethics and, artificial strong AI, is it they call it, right? That's when we expect that the AI will have emotions, self-awareness, consciousness. Are we really thinking too far ahead? And is it part of AI ethics, really?
Well, if you go back to Philip K. Dick, Arthur C. Clarke, all these novels and books, Jules Verne, if you think about it, they pondered on these kind of philosophical questions way ahead of the existence of these technologies that in a way kind of prophesized. We shouldn't let that
Again, stop us from progressing or innovating,
exactly,
right?
because the honest answer is anything we estimate, hypothesize, project is a rough guesstimation. Because when we talk about this kind of general AI, we don't know. Maybe let me caveat that. Maybe there are people out there who know, and I would love to learn from them, but I don't know. Because that point of effectively singularity, in a way, we just don't know how it's going to react. It could go all the way from developing emotioning and taking care of us like loving parents, or it could completely just say go rogue, or it could just ignore us and say, I'm not interested in you anymore. I mean, like I said, that's the thing is when I sit sometimes in panels and I hear about these conversations about governance, about control, about trust, honestly, I keep on going back and thinking about children. And I'm like, these are the questions I have, every day of, am I trusting what they're saying to me? Are they trying to tell a white lie to get that cookie, to manipulate the situation? How do I instill the right values for that? It's obviously, it's on a much greater scale because we're talking about something that is potentially infinitely intelligent from an IQ point of view, what it can do, what it can connect. Why I bring that up is because what do we do with children? We do everything in our power to give them the tools, the guidelines, the roadmap, the possibilities of a better future. And we kind of, for those who believe, we pray.
Yes.
So I know this may sound like a very kind of ominous thing to say about something that I guess that could connect to every device on the planet potentially. But my kind of view from a philosophical perspective, from an implementation, from a governance, from a policy, it really comes from that same philosophy of giving us and giving it, at a lack of a better pronoun, the tools, the capabilities, the guardrails, the approaches to approaching things, and then also, if I may add, calling out our own flaws, meaning some things, quite frankly, we are not ready. So it's not a question of can we do it, because the answer is yes, we can. The question is, should we do it? And it's one of those, when you have that extra cookie, and you go like, I really shouldn't? Yes, yeah. Can you? You can. Should you? No, I shouldn't. Same thing on some areas of AI. We should leave that cookie on the table.
Right, okay. Talking about whether we should or should not, right? Do you think that there are certain countries that should lead, these efforts, and certain countries should just take a back seat and then wait, for the right things and the right policies to happen before taking the plunge?
Slightly geopolitical there, but
yeah.
So,
or tech sectors maybe.
No, so I would say, okay, and again, this is a perspective, it's a view. One of the uniquenesses of AI, if you go one step layer, underneath the onion, is data. And what is data? Data is a representation of you. It's a representation of a process. It's a representation of a culture. So on that level, I don't think anyone can afford to or should take a mindset of a backseat. Everyone needs to be at the table. Everyone needs to be part of the conversation because, like I said, to me, in the end of the day, if you think about it from providing you a recommendation, from how it's considering, let's say, in terms of lending, medical, whatever, there is a cultural and a social element that is specific. And just to give you a concrete example, so if you look at, and again, it's not pure, but it's a mix, but if you look at, say, China takes a more statewide approach towards AI. Again, generalizing. Europe is taking a more individualistic, a rights-based approach towards AI. US is taking a more markets-based approach. Now, again, this is not clean because in truth, it's a mixture, but in broad central terms, that's how it's happening. By default, you have to talk to one another because if you think about a genuine, broad adoption of AI, it has to incorporate markets, it has to incorporate the individual, and it has to incorporate the states.
So all has something to contribute from different perspectives,
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Well, I'm very conscious that we're coming to the end of the podcast. It's been really, really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
But just one last thing,
Sure.
right? I just want to quickly mention, right? Just occurred to me, for example, this the voice that we have during this podcast, right? If once I post is available for training, right? And then one day you might find that there's someone that sounds like you doing an interview with someone that sounds like me.
So, you see, this is where I always like to joke and say that I'm one of the few fools who reads the terms and conditions.
Right, okay.
But what this kind of really shows that we can't take these things lightly. Again, you know what? Maybe I don't mind. In fact, how many times I've heard people say, "Oh, David, you sound like this person." So there will always be someone who sounds like me and all that. But you're talking about a very specific case whereby you're providing information, you're providing data that can be used in the form of others. So just like when you, let's say, give a blood sample and saying, I'm willing to provide my DNA for research, and then suddenly you come back and discover something,
That's right.
you're like, well, you kind of gave it for research. So we need to think about those things. We need to think about the downstream effect and go. And equally, by the way, it's critically important for these platforms that provide the freemium and all that and say like, oh, it's free as long as you give us the data to do whatever we want with. You know what? That's fine. That's fine. To be transparent about it.
Right, yeah. But the thing is that some of these terms and conditions run into pages. Who's going to read that, right?
That's where I believe there needs to be a change. It needs to be upfront. When I say transparent, to me, page 155, font 5.5, that is not transparent. Transparent is upfront. A good example is Zoom. Zoom had and said that, any recording on Zoom will be used. What did people say? No.
Yeah, and then they came back and said, "Will not."
Oh, we will not do it. Or to be fair to them, they said we were misunderstood. Again, the fundamental premise, not that it will save us all, but at least it's a light at the end of the tunnel. We need to be transparent.
Yeah,
we are using in this recording that you're uploading, you consent to data can be used. This means your voice, your image, and then you go. I'm not comfortable with that.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So, well, I promise I won't use your voice, to create AI and...
As long as you make it sound reasonably intelligent, I'm okay.
Yeah, with a nice AI sort of avatar. Right, okay. Thank you so much, David,
My
for your
pleasure.
time
Thank you
today.
so much for having me.
Thank you.